What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto unlocked a power that even Kami begged him to stop using? If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description to original creator of this beautiful creation. Naruto felt the kunai slam into the back of his head, and like a switch, the world went dark. Damn it, was his first thought. Actually, his first was, ah shit. So technically, wait, I'm still conscious? Was his third. If I really had to sit around, floating in endless darkness for eternity, I'm gonna be so pissed. Naruto had been fighting against Sasuke after the bastard had betrayed them, again. Seriously, why did I give him so many chances? Huh, Kurama? You there? Normally the bastard would have had a scathing comment for him by that point, so Naruto figured the fuzzball hadn't followed him into the afterlife. Naruto hovered there for hours, or at least what felt like hours. Turns out it's rather difficult to measure time when you have absolutely no point of reference. Finally, he spotted what appeared to be a white dot rushing towards him. It resolved itself into letters and words as it approached, and then slammed to a halt in front of Naruto. Game over. Naruto sighed at the sight. He'd failed, not in everything, but in enough. The Fourth Shinobi World War had been short, brutal, and bloody. The Akatsuki had been decimated by the time Pain fell to Naruto, and Obito Madara had rapidly moved to all-out war in order to capture the remaining Biju. The five great nations had allied themselves against the bastard, but it had barely been enough. Somehow the bastard had manufactured an army that left the odds nearly 1-to-1 against the Shinobi Alliance, at least numerically. White Zetsu clones were actually rather pathetic fighters. Then Kabuto showed up, and started throwing every dead ninja and the kitchen sink into the mix via Edo Tensei, impure world reincarnation. This had given the Akatsuki forces the muscle they needed to counter the allied forces' elite ninja, such as Kakashi, Guy, and the Sand siblings. Of course, once word got out that they could only be brought down via sealing, it simply came down to a matter of immobilizing them. Then the Zetsus started morphing into people, so Naruto had bolted to the front lines in order to detect them. Naruto had been wiping the floor with Zetsus left and right, even helping to take down several of the strongest Edo ninja. Then Kabuto created Edo Madara, and everything devolved into a chaotic shitstorm, because everyone thought Madara was alive. But then there was an Edo Madara dropping fucking meteors, plural, on everyone. Then fake Madara, who turned out to be Obito, revived the Jubi. Sasuke showed up, Obito Madara got control of the Jubi, Edo Madara got control of Obito Madara, and Edo Madara became real Madara, captured the Jubi, and activated the infinite Tsukuyomi. Sasuke and Naruto managed to resist its effects, and battled Madara. Once Madara had turned into Kagaya, Naruto stopped even pretending to know what the fuck had been happening. They managed to seal Kagaya using the powers Naruto and Sasuke had inherited as the reincarnations of the Rikuudo Sennin's children. Naruto had been relieved, but then Sasuke had to go and start mouthing off about revolution and slitting the 5 Kage's throats before they recovered from the Tsukuyomi. They fought, and Naruto lost. The rest is history. Naruto sighed, looking up at the massive words before him. Wonder if there's a way to speed things up? Naruto reached out and touched the words. The moment he came into contact with the letters, they seemed to melt away, only to be replaced by the words. Score. Naruto scoffed at that. Fancy new items. Great. I get cool stuff when I'm dead and can't use them. Naruto ranted angrily. I mean, come on. Even if the afterlife is seriously set up like a scoreboard, implying that we can have a second play, through, he trailed off as he considered the implications. Holy shit. He hurriedly continued reading. Action. Befriended Kurama. By managing to get through to Kurama and befriend him, you are able to import his memories into any new playthrough. Action. Oiroke no Jutsu. Action. Become a savior. By making it to the final battle, and inheriting your full power as an incarnation of Asura, you have completed one of the requirements for unlocking the Rikuudo Naruto avatar. Action. Martyrdom. By dying in order to complete the game, you have unlocked the Kekkei Genkei option. Action. Discovered heritage. By discovering the identities of both your parents, you unlocked the option to receive your inheritance from them, which was lost in the original timeline. Naruto quickly read through the list of unlocked options, slightly confused but also intrigued. Some of these sounded really kick-ass. But the last entry truly captivated him. His hands slowly drifted out and brushed the text. A link to Tucson and Ka-chan? Suddenly the text morphed again, this time revealing the words. Continue? Yes. No. Before Naruto could do anything, a brilliant column of light appeared next to him. What sounded like a chorus of angels could be heard. The light slowly faded, revealing what appeared to be a young girl, maybe 8 or 9, with minute feathered wings, wearing a single-piece simple dress that covered her entire body from her shoulders to her ankles. She practically screamed angel. Her face was shaped in such a way which seemed slightly childlike, but promised to grow into a surpassing beauty. But it was her eyes that captivated Naruto. They shimmered with mirth and laughter, reflecting a light which wasn't actually there, and hidden behind them was a look that seemed to signal vast, endless, eternal knowledge. Who is she? Naruto wondered before realizing he was staring. Hi? The girl giggled. Wondering who I am, she spoke in a melodious voice. I'm an aspect of Kami. Yup, the Kami, the guy upstairs, the head honcho if you will. Oh, Naruto said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Which really, given his day so far, it wasn't all that surprising. So, as for why I'm here. I'm an aspect of Kami, pertaining to entertainment. Basically, in order to manage being omnipotent and omniscient, we, Kami, split ourselves along the lines of a lot of different roles. I represent our fun-loving side. I'm here because you are, for lack of a better term, interesting. Your story has near infinite permeability, and it's really quite the epic journey you go on. Furthermore, you did it. You won. Naruto looked confused. Hadn't he died? Hadn't he been killed by Sasuke? And wasn't his score, while not abysmal, still pretty bad? The girl giggled again before continuing. See, you didn't actually need to survive. Sure, you beat Sasuke in some outcomes, but in the one you pulled off, you held off Sasuke long enough for Sakura and Kakashi to revive the cages, and then weakened him enough for the cages to finish the job. In short, the good guys won thanks to your actions. Now, why does that matter? Are you familiar with the concept of a seesaw? The more weight you add to one side, the more it tips that way. The universes function similarly. The more hatred, evil, and villainy, the more it tips towards darkness, giving Akuma more power. More love and compassion, more power and influence for Kami, me, us. You get the idea. By getting the good guys to win, turning 9 raging piles of hate into giant lovable guardians, and sealing Kagaya, you flipped your universe back into my court, when it was on the verge of falling to Akuma, possibly permanently. So you earned a reward. Oh, was all a dazed Naruto managed to squeeze out. After another giggle fit at Naruto's expression, Kami continued. So this is how we get here. We like watching your life. You, presumably, want to keep living. So you're going to be our entertainment for the next few thousand years. You get to live out your life, as many times as you want, with a whole bunch of perks you can unlock, if you press yes. But who wants to watch the same movie over and over again? Things will certainly be getting changed up. So here's your reward. First time through, we change nothing. The only changes will be due to the effects of your actions. You get one guaranteed no interference run to make your life as perfect as you can. What happens if I press no? I wipe your memories, we skip the boring run and just start pumping you through whatever scenarios we can make up. Oh, okay, so really no choice there. Nope, not really. Aren't you supposed to be the good guys, guy? She sighed. It's all a matter of perspective. Everything is subjective. Technically, by wiping your memories, your soul is freed, so a version of you goes to the afterlife, and we can create a new version to be our toy. Sometimes they come out weird, though. One version that we tried this with, back while you were still in the timeline, thought he was actually a Kami. That was awkward, so we're technically not harming you by doing this. That's really the key. Mortals like to make a big deal out of being selfless and self-sacrificing. Reality is more like, don't be a douchebag. At this point they both laughed, the girl somehow putting Naruto at ease. Then what about fighting? Can a war be necessary, even good, if it's for the right reasons? Naruto asked. Everything is a shade of gray, even pure black and white. But we are getting far off track. Telling you too much about things like this is against the rules. But you're kind of, well, dead and removed from the time stream. You have an answer? Naruto looked at the two options before him. He could just move on, go to heaven, and let Cammy have its fun with a different him, but he had a chance to do some real good, and to get to make the people who he cared for happier than they were in the real timeline. He had a chance to protect them from the evils in the world. Damn it all. I really don't know when to quit, do I? Still he hesitated. Last time he had dedicated his life to creating peace and stabilizing the world. Though he had succeeded, he hadn't been there to see it, and it was a damn near run thing. He hesitated because he knew that if he was going to try again he would have to fix mistakes he had made in the past, that he would have to act decisively and work towards his goal from the very beginning. And he knew that some of those mistakes were from not killing people he should have when he had the chance. Sasuke's face floated through his mind. He clenched his fists. But I can save Sasuke before he turns. Keep him from becoming the monster he was at the end, he thought. Can I really do this? Because if I go back, knowing what I know, I can't hesitate to kill if I know someone will be a threat. I know I've always said I would protect my precious people, that I would die for them. He snorted. Technically I have, but can I kill for them? But as he finally crystallized his hesitation he already knew the answer. Naruto's hand reached out before he could change his mind and slapped yes. Cammy grinned at Naruto. Good choice. Now, I'm going to head out now, places to be, things to do, people to see. But just to make sure you find everything okay, here. As she spoke Cammy held out her hand and a look of concentration scrunched up her face. Slowly forming was what looked for all the world to be a white Rasengan, spiraling sphere. After it was completed, she lowered her hand and the ball stayed in place hovering at her waist height. Your very own lantern spirit. She chirped happily. Actually, since Kurama can be carried over now, it's based on him. Based on Kurama? Naruto was rather confused. So, it's Kurama in Rasengan form? Cammy looked at the lantern for a moment. How did I never see that comparison? She wondered aloud. Well, yes, basically. It will be the Kurama you remember from the timeline. All his thoughts and memories. Only he will be able to access information on any menus you come across, and can explain how the system works to you. Anyways, I'm off. Later. And with a flash of light, she was gone. So you're basically the guide? Sweet, said Naruto, addressing the sphere. What do I do first? A loud groan came from the orb. Damn it, Kit. What did you get us dragged into this time? Furthermore, why aren't you dead? Because I distinctly remember you getting decapitated. Basically, I am dead. But Cammy treats my life like a movie, and she wants a whole series. So now I get to relive my life, with all my memories plus a few new tricks, Naruto explained. She set the whole thing up like a weird-ass video game. I got scored on my previous life and did passably, but not really good. Plus side though, I did unlock a bunch of stuff, which I guess I can use in the next run. Damn it. Why does my head feel like it's split in? Oh. Huh. Well that's new. Huh? What's new? The massive information dump I just got. So this is what it's like when all your clones release at once. Cammy almighty. I take back every time I called you a wimp for passing out from this. Wow, you admitting I'm not a wimp? Are you going soft on me, furball? So help me brat, I will rip you apart if you call me that again. Yeah, so, death threats don't really work on the dead. Naruto got the funniest feeling the fox was grinning. That's why it's not a death threat. Just imagine having to spend eternity in hundreds of pieces. All that pain, just like Hidan. Right, Naruto gulped. So memories, whatcha get? The fox laughed. Basically I'm your game manual. You're lucky I like you know. I could make this so damn confusing. The fox laughed again. You have questions about the game, I can answer them. Other than that, I'm pretty much just like I was before. I sleep in your gut and pretend the world doesn't exist. Naruto suddenly looked apprehensive. You sure you're okay with this? I mean, I know how you hate being used. And we're basically super glorified gladiators at this point. He wasn't sure quite how, but Naruto was now certain he was sensing expressions from the fox ball. Somehow he knew Kurama looked uncomfortable. Kit, damn it, cut it out brat. I'm not used to people being nice to me. Naruto smiled sadly. Look, I hate being used, but I'm fine with helping people I like. My siblings, the Rikuudo before he died, and now you. The fox sighed. If I were to stay in the timeline, I'd probably just get slapped into some other Jinchuriki's gut the moment I reformed. You're pretty much the only friend the Biju have and you're dead. Here I get to help out one of my friends. Screw it all if Cammy finds it entertaining. I'm here for you, not her, it, them. Gah, that's confusing. Alright then, step 1 is to get back into things. Cammy says I get one chance at the original storyline. Which means I get one chance to make things right for everyone. After that, who knows what they'll be throwing at us. Allow me to clarify something. You get at least one complete playthrough. Cammy may not get bored right away, and give us another shot, or only change one small thing, like someone's gender. Right, so we should plan ahead a little bit. Cammy knows you're better at that, but we don't want to fuck things over so badly we don't know what'll happen when. Wait, you actually trust ME with the plan? Well, I'll help. Besides, didn't you just say you were here to help me? The fox shook its head. Cammy, but that's weird. I'm a rampaging engine of destruction. We're a rampaging engine of destruction, right? Naruto countered. Kurama snorted and looked annoyed. Alright, look, screw planning. The entire point of this is to make the world what you want this time. Yeah, you want to make your friends happy and save the world, but don't stress about perfection. Point being, just off the top of my head, saving Sasuke the first time? That's gonna screw things royally. So, we say fuck it and screw with things to our heart's content? Not quite. Don't go insane, they'll just lock us up. Probably won't kill us, just give us therapy for the rest of our lives. And that would suck. They both shuddered. Just don't hesitate to do better, simply because you don't want to lose prior knowledge of events. Right, so how do we start the game? As if on command, a new series of text lines appeared. Main menu. New game plus. Scores. Extras. Right. Most of this is self-explanatory. New game starts a new game. New game plus, we can't use cause you died in the 4th Shinobi World War. If you ever live past it, then you can import that you into a new game and retain all jutsu, skills, and experience from that life. Naruto's eyes widened, then he burst out laughing. Once he calmed down, he noticed the fox's quizzical expression. I was just imagining the look on Orochimaru's face if we popped full Biju mode on him in the second test. Or slapped him with a Rasen Shuriken, spiraling shuriken. The fox chuckled. Scores lets you review your stats from previous lives. And finally, extras will let you spend score points from previous lives on things we can use in-game, like legendary items, Kekai Genkei, even paying to have some characters that died before out time return from the dead at some point. It also lets us view achievements, which will be mostly blank for now. By completing hidden actions in the world, we can get bonus score for the store, and we can review the list of what actions we have taken in the past here. Alright, no biggie. Just aisle 12, world warping demigod powers. Naruto joked weakly. Can we actually afford anything in the store at the moment? Nope. You kinda sucked, so we didn't get a massive haul the first time through. Most things in there cost around 10,000 points. The smallest is 5,000. What costs only 5,000 points? Your apartment not sucking. Oh, Naruto seemed to deflate. Damn, living through my childhood several times is gonna suck. Maybe I can find a way around that eventually. Oh, and before I forget, all menus and pop-ups are tied to you mentally, you can will them to do things. So you don't have to go flailing around in front of people. Naruto focused on the new game option, since he didn't really have any other choices. The menu molded itself to reveal a single option. Child of Prophecy. Naruto's Journey. This is game mode selection. Eventually we can unlock other options, like living through Sasuke's path, or Kakashi's rather than your own. For now though, we only have the one option, so go ahead and choose that one. Reaching out again, Naruto touched the text and it faded away. Suddenly he felt the sensation of falling. Looking down, he saw a gray dot which resolved itself into a concrete floor, looking like something out of a wartime bunker. Falling into the room, feeling a surprisingly light impact, given how long he had been falling, Naruto looked up to see Kurama dropping down behind him. Naruto quickly sidestepped and Kurama fell into the room in the exact spot Naruto had just been occupying. The ball of light hit the floor and bounced. Naruto choked back laughter as the ball flew sideways, ricocheting off the walls twice before stabilizing and returning to floating at around shoulder height. Naruto got the impression that Kurama was sitting stiff-backed, with his tails neatly curled, and his nose in the air, exuding an air of, "I meant to do that." Naruto gave up on holding back the laughter. He just rolled on the ground laughing. "Ha ha, Kami, I thought only cats could do that." Ha ha ha. Naruto finally calmed down and stood back up. "Sorry Kurama, but that was hysterical." The fox growled lightly, but there was no real malice in it. Damn it, the kid really got me good. Normally I'd shred a mortal for laughing like that, but with him. Seeing him laugh makes me smile. I'm going to barf. If you are finished making a fool of yourself, we can get down to business. We are now in the avatar selection room. As if his voice activated it, a wall suddenly warped and in its place was a door, through which an 11-year-old Naruto walked in, followed by a fully clothed 11-year-old version of his Oiroke form. As you can see, you have two choices. Additional characters can be unlocked by actions taken during our lives, and/or by buying some in the store. They're really expensive though. Why on earth would I want to play as a girl? Naruto asked. Check their stats, all the avatars have different effects and backstories. These two are fairly similar since they are the most basic, but some of the advanced ones can really screw with your stats and story. Naruto nodded acceptance of the fact. He almost asked how to check their stats when he had a hunch. He thought the word stats, and sure enough a window popped up next to the male avatar, who Naruto had been looking at. Uzumaki Naruto, Dobi. This avatar is the basic. During the attack of the Kyuubi, Namikaze Minato and Uzumaki Kushina sacrificed themselves to seal the demon away inside of their son, Naruto. Wishing the boy to be seen as a hero, the Sandaime presented him to the village as their savior. However, the villagers saw only the demon and showered him with hatred and spite. Stats: Physical, A. Intelligence, C. Chakra, S. Control, D. Traits: Jinchuriki, Kyuubi no Kitsune. Object of hatred: Resilient, Heritage, Uzumaki. Yondaime's child. Okay, so this is the timeline version of me. What do the different stats mean? They represent your starting capabilities, Kurama explained. Physical represents your physical capabilities, how strong and fast you are. Intelligence represents how smart and perceptive you are. When you level up, you gain stat points to distribute among your stats, and the grade you have in that area determines your starting stats. So chakra would represent my reserves, and control would be my ability to manipulate chakra? Right, so you start with massive reserves thanks to yours truly, but you have abysmal control. These are increased slightly differently. You can't put points into them when you level up, you have to actively train them by doing exercises. I see. Naruto shot the floating orb a funny look. What? The Kyuubi queried. Nothing, it's just, you're actually not that bad of a teacher. Anyways, let's check the other avatar. He looked at the female version of himself and sent the mental command to bring up the details menu. Startled at how quickly it became reflex, he realized it was rather similar to the way he commanded his Kage Bunchins, shadow clones. Uzumaki Naruto, Dobi. During the attack of the Kyuubi, Namikaze Minato and Uzumaki Kushina sacrificed themselves to seal the demon away inside of their daughter, Naruko. Wishing the girl to be seen as a hero, the Sandaime presented her to the village as their savior. However, the villagers saw only the demon and showered the girl with hatred and spite. Stats: Physical, A. Intellectual, C. Chakra, A.S. Control, C. Traits: Jinchuriki, Kyuubi no Kitsune. Object of hatred: Resilient, Heritage, Uzumaki. Yondaime's daughter. Perfected construct. So if I'm reading this correctly, then the female me has more control initially, and slightly lower reserves? Wow, that might actually be worth it. I might actually pass the academy exam that way. Pay attention to the traits as well. They aren't quite the same. The female avatar has another trait, perfected construct. Naruto looked at the list of traits. Sure enough, there was an extra trait listed after the female avatars. He looked at the traits list and mentally ordered the details window to appear. Traits. These are characteristics of an avatar which do not develop continuously like skills, nor can they be trained like stats. A trait is a special ability or status which alters the fundamentals of the character's functioning. Avatars start with certain traits, and others can be developed or lost mid-game during special circumstances. Jinchuriki, Kyuubi no Kitsune. Contained within the character is the nine-tailed Biju, the demon fox. Causes exponential growth of chakra reserves during childhood, and access to the Biju's chakra and special abilities can be developed over time. Object of hatred. For some reason, many of the people near where the character lives dislike or hate the character. They are likely to make life difficult or outright dangerous for the character. Resilient, heritage, Uzumaki. The character is preternaturally resistant to harm, either through a ruggedized body or rapid regeneration. In this case, the incredible vitality of the Uzumaki line makes the character extremely hardy and difficult to kill, but provides no regeneration. Yondaimi's daughter. Only child of the 4th Hokage, Namikaze Minato. Female version. Allows the character the chance to learn any of Minato's signature or unique jutsu. Perfected construct. Since this avatar was created based on Naruto's Oiroke form, it is a perfected version of Naruto's female form. The character grows incredibly attractive, and physically is slightly superior overall to a standard human, giving slight advantages in almost every area. Well damn, so this character is basically a super soldier? I wouldn't go quite that far. It says it's only a slight increase, meaning that it is probably a negligible boost. However, that combined with my chakra should boost the enhancement. And besides, every little bit helps, and just a little bit of speed can be the difference between life and death. I see. Is it weird that I'm seriously considering changing my gender? Kid, there are surgical operations that are carried out every day to do the same thing, for the simple reason that people want to. Maybe it's just the fact that I'm a giant mass of chakra, and therefore can select my gender at will, but I really don't see it as all that strange. Given the advantages, I think I'm going to go with this avatar this time through. I mean, for the most part it won't affect my ability to form friendships with the guys if the other girls of my generation are any indication, and it will actually improve my other capabilities. The only downside is I don't think I'm just going to suddenly adjust and like guys, which might get awkward. Then again, I'm going to save Sasuke this time, and Sakura-chan will almost certainly pick him. Sounds like a plan, kid. Naruto mentally chose the Naruto avatar and found himself drawn forward and into the body. Now, the last step is through this door. This is as far as I can go for now, since I'm going to be dropped into my own body. When you pass through here, you will arrive in a room where you can choose what options you want to use for the next life. After that, you will be dropped into your body. Don't freak out if you can't contact me straight away. You forfeit all training once you enter the new timeline, including the ability to speak with me. You will need to train to regain that ability, just like all your jutsu. Wait, so even if I remember the jutsu I can't use it? Nope, you will need to be retaught the jutsu. All your skill with the jutsu will remain, but you will need to remaster the activation of the technique. Take Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Shadow Clone Technique, and the Uzumaki Naruto Renden, Uzumaki Naruto Barrage, for instance. The moment you learn shadow clones, you can use the barrage, since it's just an application of the technique, but you need to be taught to create shadow clones. Got it. Well then, I guess I'll see you in a couple of years. Naruto waved jauntily at the fox, and despite feeling slightly nervous, strode confidently through the door. Naruto walked through the door, which disappeared behind him, into another room looking like it was from a bunker. The room was long and relatively thin, and looked to be a library. There were racks for hundreds of scrolls, organized into two sections. The section on the right had a sign hanging over it with the word, modifiers, while the left-hand section had a sign that said, items. However, they were all almost completely empty. According to Kurama, this is where I can choose the options for my next life. So the right-hand side must have options that aren't physical, and the left must be physical things I can bring in to give me an advantage. Thankfully, the scroll shelves had no backing, meaning she could easily spot the few scrolls on the shelves. She first walked to the two on the left, about a third of the way into the right-hand section. Reaching the scrolls, she saw that below each scroll, engraved into the wood, were engraved words: Kushina's inheritance, and Minato's inheritance. It was all Naruto could do not to start cry then and there. He reverently removed Minato's scroll, and opening it began to read aloud. Placing this scroll on the active shelf will guarantee the revelation of Naruto's father's identity the night the protagonist becomes a genin, and for them to receive their inheritance at that time. Tears were leaking out of the corners of her eyes now. She had only learned of her father's identity during the battle with Pain, and following the destruction of the village, Danzo had been left in charge. Naruto had had it made exceedingly clear to him by Kakashi-sensei not to reveal who her father was to Danzo. This meant that she had been unable to discuss her inheritance until after Tsunade Bashin's revival, and at that point everyone had been readying for war, and it just hadn't seemed appropriate. Then Sasuke went and killed her. Opening her mother's scroll, she saw that it read exactly the same, substituting mother for father. This was a chance to regain some link to her parents that had been lost to him in her previous life. Finally stopping her tears, she wiped her eyes, and clutching the scrolls to her chest walked to the other section of the library. Reaching the last visible scroll, she reluctantly pocketed the other 2 scrolls. Lifting the scroll from the shelf labeled, Kekkei Genkei, she began to read. Placing this scroll upon the activation shelf will grant the character any one Kekkei Genkei. Any Kekkei Genkei is valid, however only one may be chosen. Note that characters who have other Kekkei Genkei as character traits may use this scroll to obtain a second Kekkei Genkei. Additional copies of this scroll may be used at the same time. They are available in the Extras store menu. Note that conflicting Kekkei Genkei will not be valid choices. For instance, only one Dojutsu can be chosen. You may not possess both the Sharingan and the Byakugan, for instance. Similarly, you may only have one body-type Kekkei Genkei, Shikatsumyaku for instance. Note that chakra natures do not conflict. You may possess both Mukutan and Hyutan, for example. Naruto dropped the scroll in shock, stunned by the implications. She vaguely registered that the scroll vanished upon contact with the floor and reappeared on the shelf, still caught up in imagining the possibilities. ANY Kekkei Genkei in the world. This is Orochimaru's wet dream. Actually, this whole setup is, but still. Naruto idly wondered if she could create her own Kekkei Genkei as she picked up the scroll again, still in awe. Naruto walked down to the opposite end of the room from where she entered. On the end wall she found another rack of scroll shelves and another doorway. The shelf was different, however, in that each level only had room for 3 scrolls, and out of the 5 levels 4 were protected by cabinet doors which were securely locked. Probably another option to buy in the store, Naruto surmised. She placed each of the scrolls she was carrying into slots on the open shelf. As each of the inheritance scrolls touched the wood, a glowing green kanji for active appeared beneath them. As the Kekkei Genkei scroll touched the wood, a small window appeared. Select Kekkei Genkei was written across the top, with an entry field beneath it. Naruto reached her hand out to the window, and as her hand came into contact with the screen, the words, Kyoshin no Kai, Blood of Resonance, appeared in the entry slot. So I can create my own bloodline limit. There's got to be limits on that though, so that probably isn't as kick-ass as I made it up to be. I'll have to experiment. Below the words was an accept button which Naruto pressed her hand to, and the menu disappeared and a green, active, kanji appeared. Naruto smirked at the idea of Sasuke's reaction to Naruto having a bloodline ability. She couldn't decide if he would be pissed or shocked. I'm not gonna let you fall that far this time. I'm gonna save you before the darkness even gets to you. Naruto clenched her fist in determination, and strode through the final door. Waking up in her new life was hardly what Naruto expected. Then again, she wasn't really sure what she expected in the first place. The first thing she remembered was waking up one morning in the orphanage, and only having time to note her bed held the name, Uzumaki Naruto, before she was thrown out of the building. That much was expected. She was never welcome in the orphanage during the day. As she ran down the road away from the village, she glanced in the door of a store and read the date off a newspaper. Running the numbers, she was able to figure out that she was roughly 3.5. Naruto ran through the village, ignoring the hostile stares with practiced ease. She was significantly slower than she was used to, but that would come with time, and she needed to re-establish contact with Kurama fast. She may not be the smartest ninja ever, but even she knew that information was important. Going forward, she needed access to the one person who could help her understand this game. Naruto was just reaching the edge of the village when the rock smashed into the side of her head. She barely heard the scream of, "Get out of here, bitch." Around the pain, she tried to resist as she was roughly picked up by unfamiliar hands, but her child form was too weak to resist a fully grown adult. Suddenly she dropped about a foot before being caught far more gently and cradled to a man's chest. Naruto groggily looked up at her rescuer as she regained her senses. Looking down at her was a dog-masked Anbu, with gray hair that swept unevenly to the left side of the man's head. Naruto didn't need to see the transplanted Sharingan to realize that she was staring at her past, future mentor Hatake Kakashi. "Are you alright, Naruto-chan?" the silver-haired Anbu asked. Naruto nodded slightly, still having a slight headache. She looked around and saw around a dozen civilians spread out on the ground, several clearly in severe pain. Why don't we move to somewhere a little less exposed? Kakashi leapt onto a nearby roof and crouched down, setting Naruto back on her feet. He immediately began checking her over for wounds. What were you doing running off like that? You know Hokage-sama wants to make sure you are safe, and Anbu can't do that if you run away all the time. Naruto looked down at the ground. She had completely forgotten in her rush to get to work that she had Anbu guardians until her 4th birthday. The same year, coincidentally, or not, that she would be removed from the orphanage. Sorry Inu-san. I was just eager to get out today, and I forgot. Naruto stammered out the first excuse that popped into her head. Inu sighed. Well, where are you going today? He asked Naruto. Inside her head Naruto was panicking. She really didn't have an explanation for why she was in a particular hurry. She looked down to hide the panic on her face. Did something happen at the orphanage? Kakashi asked gently, unwittingly giving Naruto her way out. No, not really anyways. Sometimes I just want to get away. Naruto trailed off, passing off her reluctance to answer as not wanting to admit to any weakness. I was just going to the woods, to be alone for a bit. Kakashi for his part simply nodded sadly. Why don't I bring you out to a place out by one of the training grounds? It's a restricted area so it's less likely you'll be bothered. Naruto simply nodded her acceptance and Kakashi gripped her shoulder before they vanished in a shunshin. After arriving in a clearing a good distance from the main village, Kakashi vanished back into his overwatch position leaving Naruto to her own devices. She settled down in the shade of a tree, leaning her back against the trunk and arranged herself into a meditative pose. While she had originally not accessed her mindscape until much later, and had to be thrown off a cliff to manage it, she had subsequently learned to access her mind by meditating, and eventually on the fly. Therefore she figured she should be able to access her mindscape earlier this time. However, an hour or so later, she became infuriated with her lack of progress and slammed her fist against the trunk in agitation. Suddenly unable to sit still she leapt to her feet and began pacing. Forcing herself to calm down she took several breaths, and rallied her self-control. The hell is this? I mastered Senjutsu for crying out loud, and now I can't even sit still for an hour. Realizing she was becoming upset again she forced herself to calm again and realized that it was probably related to the game. I'm not able to bring any of my abilities to the past with me, and since the avatars mentioned stats, including mental ones, this is probably based on one of them. Pleased at the deduction despite how obvious it felt, she settled back down to resume meditating. I learned the disciple once, I'll just have to do it again. And besides I really don't have a better plan for contacting Kurama. However by the end of the day, she had been forced to get up and run simply to burn off energy several more times, and had yet to contact Kurama. And to top it all off her most recent attempt was interrupted by a loud, dang noise. She opened her eyes to see a game window floating in front of her. Through intense meditation you have increased your self-discipline. Wisdom +1. Great, she thought. The game is taunting me. She growled in frustration and allowed her head to fall backwards, banging off the tree. She closed her eyes intending to take only a short break, and wished this task was easier. She imagined herself simply falling backwards, through the tree and into her mindscape, and a moment later felt herself lying in several inches of water. Without opening her eyes she screamed, "Son of a motherfucking bitch." Which seemed humorously incongruent coming from the body of a not quite 4-year-old girl, and caused Kurama to burst out laughing. Rising from the floor Naruto found herself once again in her mindscape, complete with Kurama trapped in his cage. She ran forward, leaping up onto Kurama's snout and hugging it. "Missed you furball," she called out. HMPH. Kurama shook his head, dislodging her, before retorting, "Damn it, stop calling me that already." Naruto simply giggled before climbing back to her feet. "Good to see you too. So, we need to figure out a plan." Naruto settled down cross-legged in front of the massive fox. "There isn't much we can do till we go back to Nami no Kuni though, so lots of training? Hold up there. I know your goal for this whole thing is to try and make things turn out better for your friends, and that a lot of your troubles started when Sasuke started losing it," Kurama interrupted. "However, that isn't the only issue that caused trouble for your friends. Remember that score screen you saw when you first died?" Naruto nodded. "Yeah, stupid thing was rigged I tell ya," she shouted, pouting. Gaki, for most of your life you barely survived every major battle by relying on me. But opinions aside, it listed a score for each segment or arc of your life. You were then ranked as failed, successful, or complete. A failed segment meant you failed your primary objective but were able to continue, while a successful meant that you met your goals. However, you only received one complete, which indicates that you were able to achieve the best possible result. So what you are saying is that there is something I can do to improve almost every segment of my life, including the time prior to my placement on Team 7. Naruto exclaimed, finally realizing what he meant. Finally, the Gaki makes a breakthrough. Now we need to figure out what those things we can improve are. The things that the game would have picked up aren't necessarily things that you would have known to interfere in the first time through, so we can't rule anything out that way. However, we should focus on big things, events with far-reaching consequences. Simply meeting friends wouldn't qualify. Naruto scrunched her face in concentration. The only major events that took place anywhere near me that I can think of are the Uchiha massacre and the Hyuga affair. Either or both of those are possibilities, Kurama commented. I would plan on interfering with either or both, if only to improve things for yourself, further down the road. Naruto, however, was distracted by this as a new message appeared in front of her. Childhood arc. Bonus quest initiated. Hyuga affair. Primary objectives. Ensure Hyuga Hinata is not captured. Secondary objectives. Naruto gave a look to Kurama that clearly said, details please. Quests are split into 3 categories: story quests, bonus quests, and missions. Kurama paused to collect his thoughts. Missions are the most common and don't really affect much. They provide rewards, but won't really affect the course of events, things like D ranks. Story quests advance the story to the next stage, moving events forward, while bonus quests are the middle ground. They don't advance your story, but they do affect events, giving you a chance to improve things for the better. Naruto nodded her understanding. So the Hyuga affair would resolve itself without my contribution, but it's a chance for me to improve things, hence bonus quest. Kurama nodded. Then we are going to need to start getting stronger. From what I remember of the Hyuga affair, it should be happening sometime in the next 6 months and there was a Junin involved. Naruto nodded and rose to her feet. That message before, about increasing my wisdom, what did it mean? All of your attributes, be they physical or mental, are represented by a numerical stat. These can be increased in 4 primary ways. First, you can level up by gaining experience, which will grant you points to distribute between your stats as you see fit. Secondly, you can train, as you did before, which will provide you with benefits to your stats, but takes time. Third, you can find certain items or events in the world that will provide you one-off benefits. How will I know to spot them? Naruto interrupted. You won't necessarily. They aren't just floating symbols or something, but scrolls of lost knowledge, for instance, that would increase your intelligence. Naruto nodded her understanding. And your last option is to find trainers that can train one of your stats in exchange for Ryo. This will still take some time, but it is significantly faster than training by yourself. Naruto nodded thoughtfully. Given that no one respects me yet, I doubt I could find a trainer, and gaining experience probably requires combat? Kurama nodded to the question. Which leaves me with training and exploring for these stat boosts. Given the time frame, it's probably best if we focus on solo training the stats we are going to need most. How do I see my current stats? On K, the menu popped into existence in front of Naruto, startling her and causing her to fall backwards. Kurama snickered at her, causing her to send him a glare. She then reviewed her stats. Uzumaki Naruto. Level 1. HP 250/250ths. CP 10,100 10,100s, locked. STR 6, 4. Agi 5. Vit 25, 24. Int 5. Wis 6. LCK 50. Status Kyuubi Jinchuriki, Uzumaki Heritage, Malnourished. Stats shown with are modified. The value in the parenthesis is the effective value. Naruto looked over them. She realized that she needed to start eating better, as she had been starved almost up through the academy in the previous timeline, and her abysmal physical stats made her want to get up and go train non-stop for the next 6 months. But the part of her that had survived the 4th Shinobi War made her stop. As much as she wanted to return to the point where she could shatter mountains with her bare hands, She knew much of that had come from Kurama's influence, and besides she knew there was no way she could train to a Junin's level in 6 months. All of which meant that she needed to rely on her wits for the Hyuga affair, and her mental stats were just as bad. Naruto sighed, looks like I'd better train my intelligence and wisdom. I guess there's a lot of meditating in my future. And with that depressing thought she left the mindscape to go find food, reminded by her status that she hadn't eaten all day. Stupid brat forgot to ask how to train her intelligence. Some things never change, Kurama thought wryly, before settling in for a nap. Outside of her mindscape Naruto rose and stretched, her muscles stiff from sitting still for so long. Across the clearing she heard someone clear their throat. Standing there was the Sandame. "Hello Naruto-chan," he said kindly. Internally however he was worried. Kakashi had sent him a message with one of his hounds, notifying him that the usually hyperactive Naruto had been forcing herself to sit still all day, only moving around when it seemed she was forced to by her boundless energy. And through all of this, she would get frustrated every so often, like she was trying to accomplish something, but for the life of me I can't figure out what. Kakashi had reported to the aging leader when he arrived. "Gigi." Naruto squealed and practically flew into him. Sarutobi Hiruzen was one of the people she missed the most when he died, having been the first person to truly acknowledge her. "Why are you out here, old man?" she asked after a moment. Now Sarutobi was slightly taken aback, though not surprised, putting down the enthusiasm to Naruto's pent-up energy. She had been sitting still all day after all. "Am I not allowed to visit you?" he asked with a smile. "No, I just don't usually see you very often," Naruto said a little sadly. She was also praying that she had actually seen him recently. She wasn't sure if she had or not, and that would have made things awkward. She didn't remember visiting very often before she was thrown out of the orphanage however. The Sandame sighed tiredly. "That's true, and we did get together last week. The truth is your guards were a little worried. You've been acting very strangely today." He knelt down in front of her to look her in the eye. "Is something troubling you, Naruto-chan?" "Shit, what do I tell him?" Naruto looked away and bit her lip as if thinking to buy time. "Naruto, it's okay. Just tell me," Sarutobi said, misinterpreting her obvious stalling as not wanting to tell him. "Kit, tell him you were trying to train to be a ninja. That you saw some ninjas meditating and you wanted to try training as well." Kurama helpfully piped up inside her head. "I want to be a ninja," Naruto practically shouted. She slapped her hands over her mouth in embarrassment. She hadn't meant to shout, but to her relief Sarutobi just chuckled. "I saw some ninjas meditating and I wanted to try and be like them," she elaborated quietly. "Naruto?" Sarutobi started. "Why do you choose to be a ninja?" Naruto looked confused for a moment. She was conflicted. On one hand she wanted to tell him her true reason, the reason she had returned to the past. To protect those precious to her. On the other hand she had no reason to have developed that view yet, and she had yet to even make friends with any of the people she wanted to protect. "Do you seek strength for yourself, or for others?" Sarutobi continued seeing her hesitance. "In Konoha we believe in what we call, the will of fire. The will of fire is the ideal that we are a family, that everyone in Konoha will take care of one another. That our dreams and hopes pass on to the next generation when we die, so there is no fear in giving our lives for one another." Naruto nodded slowly. She remembered Gigi explaining this to her in her past life. It, combined with Haku's belief in protecting one's precious people, formed the foundation of his nindo. "I think I understand. Do you, Naruto? Think on it, because if you choose to walk the path of a ninja you will be swearing to uphold it, and all it entails," Sarutobi smiled. "But for those of us who understand it, it makes itself worthwhile all on its own." Naruto nodded once. "Now, why don't we get something to eat? I hear you haven't eaten all day, and I bet your stomach is going to start complaining soon." Naruto and Sarutobi were walking back through the Shinobi residential district to get to the market where the majority of the restaurants were, when Naruto suddenly realized where they were. Turning left at the next intersection, she tugged on Sarutobi's hand and pointed. "Gigi, let's go there." Sarutobi looked where she was pointing. To his surprise, she was pointing at Ichiraku Ramen. Minato and Kushina always did love that place, and I'm sure Naruto will as well. He turned to look down at her. "Are you sure, Naruto?" Naruto nodded enthusiastically and ran off towards the booth. When he caught up Sarutobi eased himself onto the stool next to Naruto. "Nay, Gigi? You're paying right? So I can have as much as I want? Naruto asked. Sarutobi hadn't really been thinking about it, but realized Naruto probably didn't have much spending money. Still, given how much ramen her mother could put away, it was probably best to put a limit on her. He turned to look at her as he replied, but as his eyes fell on her, he realized she was giving him her best puppy dog look. He felt something seize control of him, and found himself agreeing to pay for her meal. Damn, are we sure Naruto doesn't have a bloodline? Possibly a jujutsu? He mentally made a note to look into that later. Ichiraku Tuchi laughed from his place behind the counter, as Naruto bent the most powerful man in Konoha around her finger. Ah, so you must be the infamous Uzumaki Naruto I have heard so much about. Naruto suddenly looked at him warily. Yeah, what of it? Part of her hated treating Tuchi Oji-san like this, but she couldn't act familiar with him just yet. Nothing, just amazed you can cause so much ruckus. You're rather tiny, he chuckled. Naruto muttered something about not her fault under her breath. Unable to hear her, Tuchi raised an eyebrow in confusion. Not my fault I can't get enough to eat, she muttered darkly, only slightly louder. Tuchi's face darkened at this, and quickly declared, "You will always be welcome here, Naruto. You're ever having difficulties, run right in here and I'll stick up for you." Naruto looked gratefully at the man, tears welling in her eyes. It really meant something to her to hear that. Knowing that the old man would still look out for her even in another life was incredibly moving. Thanks Ogg-san, she managed to get out shakily. Sarutobi simply watched with a small smile, as he watched Naruto finally find someone to trust. You know I have a daughter just a few years older than you. I bet you would get along famously, Tuchi said as he brought them their first bowls. She is at school at the moment, but I'll be sure to introduce you next time you come through. I'll look forward to it then. Itadakimasu, Naruto said as she dug into her food. An hour later Naruto had consumed no less than 13 bowls of ramen, and Sarutobi's wallet was significantly lighter. Naruto sat back with a sigh, seemingly finally satisfied. She looked around, before asking, Gigi, can we come here again? She looked up at him pleadingly. He smiled over at her. Of course Naru-chan, though I think next time I will be limiting the number of bowls one by for you. Naruto pouted adorably at him. Now I think I can dodge my paperwork for a bit longer if we go for a bit of a stroll. Shall we? He asked as he paid Tuchi. At the end of the day, after the Sandame had walked Naruto around the park and played with her a short while, they stopped at the top of the Hokage monument, watching the sunset. Naruto knew the moment had arrived. It was time to make her intentions known to the Hokage. They might be precious few, but they are precious. The Sandame looked at her in confusion. The people who show me kindness. There aren't a whole bunch of them yet, but they are precious to me. I want to be there for them, as they are for me. She looked down at her tiny hand, and clenched it into a fist. Looking out over the village, she continued. I want to protect them so they never go through what I have. That is my reason to be strong. And I want to protect this village, so that they'll see me with something other than hate. I will show them what it means to be precious to me, and understand that I'm not a monster. It might take a lot to get them to see things your way, Naruto-chan. The Sandame didn't want to discourage her, simply for her to be realistic. Then I will be the greatest guardian this village could ever want. Naruto wasn't backing down. She hadn't in her previous life, and she sure as hell wasn't going to start now. The way you say you want to protect the village, it sounds like you want to be a Hokage. Sarutobi was almost brought to tears at the girl's sentiment. After all they have put her through. Whatever it takes, was her only reply. The Sandame Hokage allowed a few quiet tears to run down his face as a bittersweet smile appeared. He was awed by the quiet determination and strength behind the young girl's voice. Standing at her shoulders, he could easily imagine the shadows of two of his greatest friends, one blonde, and one red-headed. They will remember this day in history, as the day a Hokage was created. Naruto finally stopped sprinting as she reached the middle of a training field which the Sandame had agreed to allow her to use. She sat down cross-legged and rapidly sank back into her mindscape. It was the morning after she had arrived back in time and she was going to begin her training. First, however, she wanted to check in with Kurama, to see about the best way of training her stats, hence her visit to her mindscape. Kurama, wake up, it's training time, she shouted as she materialized right on top of said fox's nose. Kurama, having been rather peacefully asleep, was caught off guard by the sudden appearance of his warden, and jumped upright spluttering. Naruto, for her part, was flung backwards into one of the bars of the cage, which she bounced off of, with no harmful effect, since this was all inside her mind. Damn it, Gaki! Kurama slammed his paw down on Naruto's form, her head poking out between two fingers. I am not some house pet to be jumped on whenever you feel like it. He seethed. Naruto's expression immediately morphed into one of contrite submission. Sorry Kurama. The Biju sighed. I think coming back in time is affecting you more than we thought, he stated gruffly. Between the drop in your effective intelligence and wisdom stats, as well as being prepubescent again, particularly as the opposite gender is probably doing horrible things to your self-control and judgment. Naruto nodded sadly. Yeah, and since the mental portion of me now recognizes you aren't an enemy, the emotional part of me is making me act like a hormonal girl. Well, there is a fix for that, and I believe that is why you are here, Kurama stated. Training, specifically for your mental stats. I am a guide, and therefore can tell you how things work, but I was not given knowledge on how specifically things will affect you. Huh? Was Naruto's intelligent response. The fox sighed again. I cannot tell you which stat would be best trained to increase your mental state. Wisdom increases your ability to make deductions, so you might be able to tell which ideas are bad, increasing by increasing your judgment. Intelligence, however, will increase your mental fortitude, allowing you to better resist anything that might affect your judgment. Naruto ed in understanding and looked thoughtful. Since I don't have shadow clones, I can't do both, which means we have to pick one. I think we should train my intelligence first. At Kurama's questioning look, she explained. First off, wisdom will only allow me to know something is a bad idea, but not resist the temptation of doing it anyway. If I learned anything from my first time being drunk, it's that knowing something is a bad idea and deciding not to do it are two very different things. Secondly, intelligence, from what I recall of your explanation, denotes my ability to memorize and learn things. Wisdom helps me make better choices based on that knowledge. At present, my ability to learn and retain knowledge is practically nil, and I don't have a lot of data about the situation I memorized previously, which means I am going to have to get information, which requires intelligence, before wisdom can be helpful. Well reasoned. I concur. Kurama grudgingly admitted. Now to train intelligence, simply requires attempting to learn and memorize information. In a word, studying. Naruto groaned as she left the mindscape. Later that day, Naruto was wandering the village, slipping from back alley to back alley. She knew she wasn't going to see the Hokage for at least another several weeks, and any attempt to speak to her Anbu guardians was ignored. That either meant that the ones that hated her were on duty, or they were absent, both of which meant if she got mobbed she was in trouble. None of which was any help with her current situation of having no place to study, since the librarian had promptly thrown her out as soon as she arrived. So here she was attempting to find her way home without getting spotted, since she really didn't feel like getting beaten that day. Growling in frustration, she slammed her fist into the wall beside her, before taking several deep breaths. Remember, Naruto, you were better than this. You can get there again, just keep control. Repeating this mantra in her head, she regained control of her emotions, without launching into a tirade like she once would have. It was then that she noticed the brick her fist had impacted pushed in slightly. Pushing a little harder, she felt it give slightly, then click. A plate of earth rose in front of her, revealing a metal contraption. Glancing around, she confirmed the alley was empty before kneeling down to examine the device. Puzzle lock version V. Difficulty: high. Danger: low. Something about this struck her as odd. Why was the difficulty so high if the danger was low? She sent a query towards Kurama to get his opinion. Probably an age thing. Locks like this pose a danger by releasing jutsu stored in seals as traps at those who failed to disarm them properly. Looking at this one, it hasn't been charged in at least 10 years. Kurama explained, seals, particularly ones made by those relatively inexperienced, leak power over time and eventually lose all function. So it's still difficult to unlock, but its fangs have dulled. Got it. Naruto acknowledged. How did you know that anyways? I was sealed into Uzumaki Mito for around a century, remember? I learned much from watching through her eyes. While I might have no need for puny human techniques, it was still more interesting than nothing. Naruto nodded. That seemed fair. She still had no clue how to get through the door though. She tilted her head to the side. Remembering her experiences in the other world that she had visited after death, She mentally summoned a help window. Congratulations on finding your first minigame. Within your life you will find many instances of prizes that can be earned by completing challenges. These challenges can differ greatly and can have time constraints, enemy action, or other effects to vary them. Puzzle lock. The goal of puzzle lock challenges is to find the correct sequence of mechanisms to trigger the door's opening. Beware, triggering incorrect mechanisms could trigger a trap. Well, that was both informative and useless, Naruto thought irritably. So I have to push the right buttons to open this thing, and there are consequences to getting it wrong. Examining the device further, Naruto saw that it consisted of a number of circular tracks, which slid in and out of one another, to form several smaller tracks within the smaller section. Held on these tracks were a number of moving segments. Several had kanji written on them, and on further inspection Naruto realized that several of the smaller circles had matching kanji written on them. So logically, I had to get the segments that correspond to the circles into those tracks in order to get the door to open. The trouble with that idea was that pushing on one segment caused all the segments to move, meaning Naruto couldn't just push them where they needed to go. As she fiddled with the lock, one of the symbols, which was the kanji for fire, fell into the ring for wind, and a fireball was promptly spat at Naruto. Scrambling back, Naruto glanced her status screen and saw that her health had decreased by only 10 hit points from the glancing blow. She let out a shaky breath. From the angle of that shot, if that fireball had been full-sized, rather than weakened, it would have incinerated anyone in this alleyway. Whoever made this thing really didn't like visitors. Getting back to work, Naruto reversed her last move, and went back to studying how the whole thing moved. That was when she noticed that the symbols were slightly out of order from how they were before. Water was now on the other side of Earth, which meant she had somehow affected their order. Casting her gaze around, she realized that each of the smaller circles held different numbers of segments, meaning that if she loaded a symbol onto one she could hold it there for a number of cycles until it was where she wanted. Naruto continued to play with the thing for the next several minutes, and almost half an hour later she had finally gotten them all into the right order, but their spacing was wrong, so she spent another 15 just trying to get them spread out so they all entered the rings at the same moment. She wasn't sure that was necessary, but she didn't feel like dodging more fireballs than was strictly needed. Finally, with a last click, the symbols all slid into their correct rings, and the lock unlatched, swinging upwards. Puzzle lock completed. Difficulty: hard. Wisp +2, int +2. Well, that is convenient, Naruto thought as she lifted the trapdoor upwards. Looking down at dark passageway below her, she fired off a thought at Kurama. Any ideas on not dying the spooky tunnel? Don't go in the creepy tunnel, he suggested. That sounds boring, Naruto replied and leapt into the tunnel. Naruto landed on a dusty floor and promptly fell on her ass, as her ankles screamed in pain. Without chakra to reinforce her joints, or the intense conditioning she got as a shinobi, even a short fall could be debilitating. Shit, keep forgetting I'm a small girl. Apparently Kurama thought the absurdity of that statement was hilarious and chuckled in the back of her head. Of course, being a titanic demon fox, it came out far more menacing than amused, which in no way helped Naruto cope with what she saw when she looked up. When she finally figured out that she was staring at a decomposed, partially dissected human torso, she promptly threw up. Recovering somewhat, Naruto stood back up and stepped into the room, a laboratory she surmised, proper. It was rectangular with several tanks full of an unidentified liquid against the far wall, and the short passageway leading back to the exit Naruto had dropped into. All along the walls were racks of tools and instruments, most likely used for the experiments that took place here. The main space of the room was taken up by several operating tables, thankfully only one of which was occupied, and which Naruto was now doing her best not to look at. As she crossed into the room properly, a ding sounded and a message appeared. Secret discovered. One of Orochimaru's lost labs. Labs discovered, 1 of 10. When Orochimaru was forced out of Konoha, he was forced to abandon much of his work. Due to his paranoid nature, many of his workrooms are well hidden, and were never discovered by the Leaf after he left. Find them all to get a special reward. Great, so there were more of these places waiting for her to stumble across. After giving the place a cursory examination, she found little of any value to her at the moment. The key exception to that was a scroll, that when she touched it had prompted a window to appear. Orochimaru's experimental record, value 0. Orochimaru's records of his experiments turn into the Hokage as proof of discovery. Based on that discovery, she figured that if she was going to get anything out of this, it would be by reporting this to the Sandaime, so she turned and climbed back out of the hole and turned towards the Hokage tower. Hiruzen was not happy. He had been returning to his office after handing out the day's missions, when he had spotted Taka, one of the Anbu supposed to be guarding Naruto, out of uniform and mask, goofing off with others outside the window. Furious, he had immediately dispatched additional Anbu to both drag Taka off to T and I to find out why he thought it was acceptable to abandon his post and to find and guard Naruto. That was when the news that had truly made him angry came in. Anbu couldn't find Naruto. It was like she had just dropped out of Konoha. He had attempted to use his crystal ball to locate her, but all he saw was a dark fog, which he knew from past experience only showed up when he was attempting to look for something concealed by a jutsu. Immediately jumping to the logical conclusion, he had deduced that Naruto had been kidnapped and began sending tracking teams to pick up her trail around the edges of the village. His office was a hive of activity, but there was little good news. No trails had been detected around the village, which meant highly skilled infiltrators or enemies within the village. Neither prospect was particularly appealing. It was as he was reaching this conclusion that the number one suspect inside the village walked into his office. "I heard the Jinchuriki was kidnapped. This wouldn't have happened if you let me train her," Shimura Danzo stated. "Naruto is not a weapon to be crafted. She is a 3-year-old girl, deserving of a childhood." The Sandaime refuted almost automatically. "But I am here to offer any aid I can in locating her." Danzo finished as if the Sandaime hadn't said anything. "She is an asset to this village and I wouldn't see her lost needlessly, even if you are preventing her from reaching her full potential." It was an old argument between them, and not one that would be resolved anytime soon. Danzo would simply wait, and when Sarutobi finally stepped down as Hokage, he would be able to craft Naruto into a blade which would ensure Konoha's dominance for decades to come. Her happiness was a small price to pay for that. It was into this glaring match that Sarutobi's secretary's voice carried. "I'm sure he'd be happy to see you," she was saying. "Are you sure? If he's busy I can come back later. Hokage is a stressful enough job as it is." Sarutobi and Danzo's eyes widened in unison. That was Naruto's voice. They turned towards the door as the secretary pushed door open and escorted Naruto into the room. "I'm sure seeing you will take a load off his plate," she said with a giggle. "Thank you, Akira-chan," said Sarutobi as he was already halfway across the room. "Naruto, where have you been?" he interrogated. She was filthy, covered in grime and what looked suspiciously like specks of dried blood. "I found one of Orochi Tomi's bases," she said simply. Sarutobi spluttered at the irreverent name for one of his former students. Even if he was a traitor, he was still a Sannin and people tended to be wary of calling the Sannin names. Danzo immediately replied, "Preposterous. They were all destroyed following the traitor's escape. All the ones you could find maybe. Here," she handed her Gigi the scroll. "I found that down there. It was pretty well hidden. I only found it 'cause I punched part of the activation trigger in frustration." Glancing at the first foot of the scroll, Sarutobi could immediately tell that it was legitimate. "Why don't you tell us the full story, Naruto?" he requested. Several minutes later she was winding down the story, and then I came straight back here. Sarutobi nodded thoughtfully. Upon hearing the location of the base, he had immediately signaled several Anbu to secure the base. The last thing they needed was a civilian wandering in there. He was currently trying to think of a way to properly reward Naruto. He couldn't just pay her as a mission, she wasn't even an academy student yet. "Well, I think you have earned a reward," he started. He was thinking of setting up some kind of special food account for her so she could get more of the ramen she seemed to enjoy so much. If Naruto had realized that, she probably wouldn't have said anything, but as it was she spoke up. "Could you maybe get me access to the library?" she asked quietly. "I want to be ready for the academy, but the librarian won't let me in to study." "That is not a reward, Naruto. That is addressing a basic privilege of Konoha citizens which has been denied you," ground out Sarutobi, doing his best not to explode. "Neko-chan?" said Anbu appeared before him. "Kindly educate the misguided librarian." Wordlessly the Anbu vanished from the room. "Yay, today was actually pretty successful. Now I can get into the library to train," Naruto thought cheerfully. Out loud, however, all she said was, "Then I'm good really. Wish I didn't have to deal with the meanies at the orphanage," but she trailed off and shrugged as if to say, "What are you gonna do?" Sarutobi, however, immediately changed tracks in his mind. Normally he would never allow such a small child to live on her own, but he figured since she would have Anbu's supervision it might be alright. And if she was being harassed at the orphanage, then it really couldn't be much worse for her there. He smiled down at her as he said, "How would you like your own apartment, Naruto?" And so the next month and a half passed for Naruto. She was soon moved into her new apartment, which was fully furnished by the Anbu which had purchased it. She wasn't sure if it had been the same as last time, but this time she was able to identify several pieces of furniture grown by Tenzo's Mukuten techniques, which might explain some of how the Anbu always knew when her house was getting invaded. She spent the majority of her time in the library, usually seated at a table near one of the doors, so she could periodically get up and sprint around a little to burn off her insane amounts of energy, something she had gradually tapered off doing as she trained her statistics. She had spent hundreds of hours studying and had eventually hit a plateau where she just wasn't increasing her stats fast enough to feel worthwhile, somewhere around the 15-point mark. At that point, however, she was down to only having to get up and run around once around lunchtime. However, without finding something to accelerate her training speed, training her intelligence didn't seem worthwhile at the moment. So she switched on to meditating. As she spent more time meditating, she gradually saw her wisdom stat increasing. It was only about a week later, however, that she hit that same plateau of success, where it took more than a week to gain a stat point rather than a day or two. She did notice that the difficulty seemed to jump every 5 points or so, and exponentially at that. She mentally thanked her boosted intelligence for that deduction. She had been reviewing her stats and what she had been studying when her wisdom came back into play. She realized that she hadn't really been studying any one thing in particular, she had just been doing as Kurama had said, reading and memorizing information. The trouble was, though, she didn't understand any of it. She was going to need to start with the basics and work her way up to more advanced topics. That was when she went back and started studying specific topics. Her first choice was cooking, since the shinobi archives were still off limits to her, as she wasn't in the academy yet, and she wanted to make better ramen. That was when two things happened. First, she started getting more points again, and secondly, she developed a new skill. Cooking, active, crafting, LVL. 01, 0.00% carbon monophosphide. 0, basic. The ability to prepare food for consumption. Success is based on mastery of cooking, mastery of recipe used, and quality of ingredients. It was relatively simple and vague, but part of her understood that was a good thing. That meant it applied to a lot of things. So she went and picked up a recipe for ramen, and started practicing at home to prepare her own ramen. She knew she would have to learn to make more varieties sooner or later, but she was less than 4, so sue her. The other major thing that came up was when Naruto realized that she was going to have to start thinking about things like she was in a game. She had played few in the past, but they had easily indicated to her that there was a major disconnect in between how they interpreted the world, and how reality worked. Since reality, for her at least, now worked somewhat like a game, she realized she might need to start treating reality slightly differently. So she resolved to read several guides to those games and compare them to what Kurama knew they could expect. There had been one gem that had helped her come up with a plan to deal with the Hyuga affair quest. In video games, particularly those in which strategy is more prominent, there exists a technique known as kiting. Kiting is the practice of engaging an enemy and immediately falling back in such a way that the enemy follows. This can serve a number of purposes. In RTS games, it allows players to pull units that are unsupervised out of position, allowing them to be engaged by a weaker force individually. In RPG games, it is used in a similar manner. Many players will take on quests above their level, and kite the necessary quest targets back into guards or other neutral NPCs, and thus getting them killed. While this causes the loss of any express or loot drops from the enemies themselves, it does allow the player to complete quests early, often providing them with a significant lump sum of experience, multiplied by a difficulty factor, and access to reward loot quite powerful for their level. It had been this excerpt that led Naruto to the conclusion that this was going to have to be her strategy for the foreseeable future. While she knew she could become the kind of fighter that could terrify her opponents, she wasn't there at the moment, and that meant that she was going to have to resort to relying on others. Fortunately for her, she had a reputation as a prankster, and the Hyuga had a compound full of guards. This meant Naruto had a prank and a plan. It was finally time. 2.5 months had passed since Naruto arrived back in time, and she had spent that time as well as she could. Uzumaki Naruto. Level 1. HP 250/250ths. CP 100,000 100 100,000 100s. Locked. STR 6 4. Agi 5. Vit 25 24. Int 21. Wis 16. LCK 50. Status Kyuubi Jinchuriki, Uzumaki Heritage, Malnourished. Stats shown with are modified. The value in the parenthesis is the effective value. Cooking, active, crafting, LVL 15, 43.72% carbon monophosphide. 0, basic. The ability to prepare food for consumption. Success is based on mastery of cooking, mastery of recipe used, and quality of ingredients. Stealth, active and passive, utility, LVL 35, 19.01% carbon monophosphide. 0, basic. The ability to remain undetected without expending chakra. Encompasses chakra suppression, silent movement, and concealment. Passive mode will not hide oneself from active detection, but instead partially suppresses the user's chakra to hide their true strength. Active mode can be activated to attempt to hide from active detection, as well as to conceal evidence of one's passing. The stealth skill had been created when she was attempting to hide from a passing mob a month or so previously, and the young Jinchuriki had immediately thrown everything into leveling it. It would be instrumental to her plan. Overall, she had spent roughly 2 weeks leveling up her int, before switching to her wis. She spent 2 weeks on that before having her breakthrough and switching back to int. A further 2 weeks in the library had netted her all she felt she was going to get, and when she had discovered her stealth skill, she had thrown her all into mastering it. Earlier that day, the Kumo ambassador had arrived to much fanfare, which Naruto had observed from an alleyway. Once she confirmed that he would be staying with the Hyuga that night, she moved off to secure the materials she would need for her plan, namely an ungodly number of eggs, and a significant amount of string, as well as some tacks. She had also reviewed the quest with Kurama and gotten the rundown on what he believed the question marks had meant. Flashback. Childhood arc. Bonus quest. Hyuga affair. Primary objectives. Ensure Hyuga Hinata is not captured. Secondary objectives. So what do you think the question marks are? Naruto asked Kurama one night as she stared at the quest prompt. Kurama grumbled about asking the obvious. They represent objectives you should try and meet, but which you haven't discovered yet, he yawned. Most story missions will not have any primary objectives unknown, since they are usually the entire reason you are in that region. But bonus objectives are just things that you might be able to do to improve things. Right, but what are these question marks? She asked. I mean, there isn't really a good way to plan to do something that I have no idea what it is. Well, the primary object is something that happened last time, and we just aren't making the connection that it is an objective. So, something like subduing the Cloud Junin? With a ding, the first question mark filled in. Huh, well that was easy, and I already have a plan for that. Then the bonus objectives, ensure that the Junin isn't killed? A second ding and another question mark was replaced. End flashback. And so the quest now read. Childhood arc. Bonus quest. Hyuga affair. Primary objectives. Ensure Hyuga Hinata is not captured. Detain the kidnapper. Secondary objectives. Ensure the kidnapper is not killed. Thankfully Naruto had a plan that should, hopefully, complete all of the known objectives without too much hassle. She was simply going back to one of the age-old truths of infiltration missions. Discovery meant death. On an infiltration mission, one was intentionally putting themselves into a hive of enemy activity, and being discovered meant you were cut off and outnumbered. So Naruto planned to do a little infiltration of her own, and allow herself to be discovered around the same time that Kumo's spy should be attempting to make his move, which would lead to the whole compound being on high alert and eventually his capture. Since he would be staying only the one night, shinobi weren't really big on trust, even when at peace. Even neutralizing him for one night should be enough. Naruto slipped into the compound using a tree as a makeshift ladder. Once on the other side, she blended into the shadows, using what she remembered of the guards' patrol patterns to avoid their periodic Byakugan sweeps. She made a mental note to tell Gigi to get them to switch them up. Most people believed that the Hyuga compound was impossible to infiltrate since the Byakugan could see through most buildings. But what most people didn't know was that a relatively simple sealing array which absorbed the chakra traces the Byakugan was sensitive to, blocked the fabled Dujutsu. And since the main branch liked their privacy, their house and several others had such seals scattered over them, which rendered infiltrating the compound down to a matter of timing one's movements, so you were always behind such a wall when the guards were looking. Naruto had created a mental map of all of them when he was pranking the Hyuga regularly, and Kurama had helped him dredge it out of his mindscape. Naruko had just finished setting up her prank in the first few buildings when she spotted a second shadow moving across a courtyard. She could see him easily enough, but he was sheltering behind a Byakugan-proof wall. Looking around, she realized that she didn't have a way to get detected. Without making it painfully obvious she was doing it deliberately. She was infiltrated far enough into the compound that she obviously knew the secret to getting around undetected. She had planned on accidentally waking up one of her victims, but that was no longer an option. She didn't have time to reach one before the Junin escaped. Then she noticed that based on his direction of movement he would have to hide behind the wall she was behind next. Looking behind her and biting her lip, she saw the tree she had once used to escape after a prank. She could be over it in a hot second, but that didn't solve the problem of the escaping Junin. She took stock of her materials hoping for inspiration, but all she had was eggs and string. No Junin was going to fall for a tripwire made with white twine, and eggs pretty much only useful as ammunition for pranks or if her opponent was made of paper. Naruko's head snapped to her left. There, stuck to the wall, was the seal, painted on rice paper. Seals were incredibly fragile, she remembered, and all it took was a single messy stroke to keep them from working. She grinned rather foxily. Then she egged the seal and ran. Hyuga Hiyashi glared after the man being dragged off towards T&I. The Kumo ambassador had apparently been attempting to kidnap his daughter, when he had been detected by the guards and stopped. Elite though he might have been, it was still nearly 30-1, and he had been subdued even before he arrived. Something about the events of the night bugged him, however, as the Junin had nearly made his escape, using the privacy walls as cover before being detected. Why had he slipped up then? Not that he was complaining, mind you. His brother walked up to him. "You are probably going to want to see this, brother," he said shortly. He decided not to ask why he was covered in egg at the moment, at least until his brother led him over to the wall where the Junin had been captured. The seal was also rather completely covered in egg. "I believe we had a second infiltrator tonight," he said. "Indeed, but where is she?" Neither needed to speak as to who they were referring to. Uzumaki Naruko was already quite infamous around Konoha. If she was here, why didn't we find her? Instead of answering, Hiyashi activated his eyes and surveyed the alleys around the compound. He spotted Naruko concealed within one, watching with ill-concealed satisfaction as the Junin was dragged away. Smirking, he replied, "I suspect we won't find her because she left after finding better prey." He indicated to Hisashi, "I suspect we all would have woken up like you tomorrow morning if this had not occurred. Instead we woke up now, and the wall took the eggs intended for us. If this is true, then why did she not come forward? She would be a hero," he asked. "But would she be received as such?" he replied. Finally realizing his brother was watching someone, he also activated his Byakugan and quickly spotted Naruko. And if she knew she would receive no recognition, why did she act? Why indeed? I rather like what this says about the girl. It seems the next generation will bear watching. He paused and thought, "I think it best we concealed her presence tonight, as it would favor her not for it to be discovered. We shall have to signal our appreciation another way." He smiled as he watched Naruko finally turn away and begin the trek back to her home. "But find a way to show it we shall," he vowed to himself. She was standing in the clearing she was planning on using to train, but she had run into a problem. She had no idea what to train. In her past life she had almost always had a sensei to teach her after she graduated from the academy, and prior to that she had been a mess, since she really didn't know what she was doing. Now she had the system to guide her, but she didn't know where to focus. She had asked Kurama what she should train in, and he had simply told her to figure it out herself. His only advice had been to address her weaknesses. which had of course led her to improving her chakra control, which had been stymied once again. Flashback. Sooner or later you are no longer going to have someone dedicated to training you, and you will need to learn how to train yourself, Brad. And the Cyclops will have to split his time between you and 2 other brats as well, so knowing how to manage your own training will be important then as well. Kurama finished his rant at her. Naruto looked down, frowning as she was forced to acknowledge that the offensive, foul-tempered fox was correct. Do you have any advice on how to set up a training regimen then? Kurama growled. I'm a giant fox. What makes you think I would train even remotely similarly to you? And besides, I never really had to train, idiot. Perks of being one of the most powerful beings in existence. He sighed. The one thing I can tell you is to train your weakest points. Anything you are weak in your opponents will take advantage of, and that will get you killed. It's how your father sealed me, by taking advantage of things I could encounter. Your mother's chains and his fuinjutsu primarily. Naruto wasn't really sure what to train in then, since she didn't have any combat ability at this point, she didn't really have a weak area to train. However, every teacher she had ever had told her that she needed more chakra control, but she couldn't train that since she hadn't unlocked her chakra. But maybe it was affected by a stat? Most of the stats were fairly self-explanatory, but she wasn't sure exactly what each of them affected. Strength was obviously her muscles, which would benefit taijutsu, and agility was her speed, also affecting taijutsu, but she didn't really know what vitality would affect, past her stamina. Similarly, intelligence and wisdom probably related to her ability to think clearly and memorize information, but she didn't know if they would affect her jutsu in any way. Nay, Kurama? She asked. Is there a stat that would affect my chakra control? Kurama grumbled. Not by itself. Chakra control is a skill, and most skills have a stat draw that they improve from, but none of the stats will do anything directly, Kurama sighed. And before you ask, no, I don't know which stat, though I would guess wisdom or intelligence. Then do you know what stats will affect which type of jutsu? Annoying brat. Broadly speaking, strength and to a lesser extent agility modify taijutsu, agility and to a lesser extent strength affect bukajutsu, intelligence and to a lesser extent wisdom strengthen genjutsu, and wisdom and to a lesser extent intelligence affect ninjutsu. Now go figure this out, and let me sleep. The fox finished with a roar. Flashback end. That had been 20 minutes ago and Naruto still wasn't sure where she should be training. In her previous life she had fought primarily as a close-range ninjutsu using brawler. Her strategy largely consisted of using whatever means possible to get close to her enemies and slamming them with a Rasengan, and later hitting them from range with a thrown Rasenshuriken. And technically before that her strategy was just a massive barrage of Kage Bunshin. Going this route had a number of problems though, considering that anyone that could match her physically would be able to dominate her in a fight. And furthermore, she didn't want to wait to learn Sage Mode again to get a ranged attack. Thinking of Sage Mode also reminded her of the fight against Pain, where she had been completely reliant on natural energy to match the Akatsuki's leader physically. The brief period she lost that boost she had nearly died, and only the intervention of the Geezer Toad had saved her. However, going with a taijutsu-focused build had similar issues with attacking from range. Short of opening the gates, pure taijutsu lacked a powerful ranged option. With a few notable exceptions, the Hyuga's Gale Palm came to mind. None of which helped her figure out where to train. So she started looking at things she could and couldn't do. Firstly, she knocked genjutsu out the window, as it had always been a fact that she would never have the control to use high-level genjutsu. Conversely, ninjutsu usually benefited from his massive store of chakra, so those were an effective option for his ranged attacks. Which lead him to needing an effective melee option. Strength for taijutsu was an obvious choice, and his other option was agility, which Kurama said would help him with bukajutsu. Taijutsu is cool, I mean look at Guy and Lee, those two are monsters. But they rely on speed as much as strength, so I would have to train up my speed anyways, which is adding another stat to my load. Naruto hummed and thought. Speed on the other hand, weapons might be useful in close combat, particularly if I can get one with some reach. And there are close combat ninjutsu that can amplify my damage in hand-to-hand if it's necessary, so there's no real loss. Having decided, Naruto closed her stats window and got ready to start running. Before she started, however, she heard a ding and a new game window appeared. Well done. Planning ahead and organizing yourself increases your wisdom. Wisdom +3. Naruto grinned and started to sprint. IAMALINE. A few days later Naruto was walking towards the library to do some additional research. She had spent a solid 3 days doing sprints to increase her agility stat. She had started to worry about hitting the plateau at around 15 points, and was looking for a new way to train her agility. She was hoping that there would be a better form of training that would net her a few more points in the same way that focusing her studying had helped with her intelligence. As she walked, however, she pondered just how effective her training was. She knew that she had increased her stats by several points and knew that she was significantly faster than she had been, but without knowing how her stat points scaled against an actual shinobi's abilities, she had no idea if she was doing well or if she needed to seriously step up her game. No pun intended, she thought. She looked over at a group of ninja leaving on a mission, their client striding after them. Genin, she assumed, given that 3 of the 4 had headbands but no flak jackets, and 1 was in a full Jonin uniform. She stared at them, trying to learn what she could about them, to draw out some information that would help her compare herself to them. The Genin she was staring at seemed physically rather pathetic by what she remembered, his physique reminding him of Sakura's when they first graduated. May she never find out I thought that, she thought with a shudder. It was the eyes that caught her attention, however, darting about rapidly, his gaze turning to take in everything around him, memorizing and learning where everything was. His intellect must be high, she thought, remembering what Kurama had said about intelligence affecting memorization. Dang, through continuous observation a new skill has been created. Observe, active, sensory, LVL. 1, 0% carbon monophosphide. 0, basic. The ability to determine information based on sensory information. Uses all available senses. Additional information available based on level. Additional information available based on supplementary skills. Grinning, Naruto turned her new skill on the genin she had been observing. Yamazaki Hirotada. Level 47. HP 3737 3737. CP 2644 2644. STR 38. Agi 37. Vit 53. Int 122. Wis 68. LCK 89. Additional information. Status unknown. Naruto gave a low whistle as she looked at the genin's attributes. Certainly she had been right, and his physical attributes had been pathetic, only slightly better than her own mental attributes which she had been training. His mental attributes were nothing to scoff at, however, his wisdom being double her own, and his intelligence 4 times greater. She assumed his unknown status would become available as she leveled up the skill and learned more to call on. Deciding to try and get a sense of whether his stats were average or not, she turned her gaze to the other members of his team. The Kunoichi was her next target. Muranaka Yui. Level, HP, CP, STR, Agi, Vit, Int, Wis, LCK. Additional information. Status unknown. Naruto growled in frustration. She had gotten exactly what she needed for once, and now it turned out to be broken. A bunch of question marks summed up exactly what she knew already. She tried it on the other ninja and got the same result, learning only their names. She glared at the ground in front of her as she continued towards the library. What was different after the first time? Can it only be used so often? But that wasn't mentioned in the description. Pondering her problem, Naruto continued to walk along, and tried her ability again, this time on a civilian woman carrying a bag of groceries. Nishioka Yayoi. Level 28. HP 672 670 seconds. CP 987 987. STR 19. Agi 25. Vit 16. Int 21. Wis 26. Luck 30. Additional information. Status unknown. She frowned despite the skill's success. Trying it again, she got all of another civilian's information, the only unknown being his status. Shaking her head in confusion, she continued on towards the library. Like my brothers, I too am a line. Naruto was no more enlightened when she arrived. She had spent the trip there observing everyone she came across, and had even managed to level the skill up twice, but she was no closer to learning what had made the question marks appear. She had however developed a sense of the stat levels of civilians. They were almost all in the 20s for level, with a stray 30 or 32. Their stats were at a similar level, typically in the high 20s, low 30s, with one stat significantly higher than the others, and one significantly lower. She had originally come to the library to look for different types of agility training, but puzzling out this new skill might be just as important. Information was power, and given that this seemed to give her information from a vacuum, it could be critical if she could understand it. Having decided, Naruto wandered over into the leisure section of the library, rather than head to her usual table in the non-fiction section. Walking over to the computer, she pulled up the catalog and looked for the books she would be needing. Locating their call numbers, she pulled down several gaming guides she had used to study gaming strategies previously, as well as a treatise on game mechanics and math. A short while later, she found what she thought she was looking for in the treatise. In many games, it is possible to leave the areas recommended for a player's current level, and venture into higher level zones. This is not generally advised, as there are a number of ways this is discouraged. Not only will the enemies be more powerful, they will frequently gain multipliers when attacking low-level players, and there are occasionally utilities required to safely navigate the area that the player may not have access to yet. When a player accesses such an area, they will often see enemies' levels and information shown as a skull or similar symbol, showing that they are currently far outside the player's ability to handle. So she couldn't see the level and stats of those ninja because they were too powerful for her? That made unfortunate sense. The average genin was worth a dozen or more bandits, and she was an untrained child. Any genin worth their headband would destroy her without even noticing. Sighing at the disappointing result, she got up to go find a book on speed training. Moping about the skill wouldn't modify it, so she would just need to get stronger. As she walked towards the non-fiction section of the library, she didn't notice the pink-haired girl watching her curiously. Naruto settled down with her selections a few minutes later, including a training manual written by none other than Might Guy. She was going to start with that one, and a number of civilian self-defense technique scrolls. Shinobi taijutsu scrolls would have better options, but she wouldn't have access to them until she graduated, if then. Ninja were very protective of their skills. She was engrossed in reading about Guy's methods of increasing strength and speed. He openly admitted in the preface that this was an incomplete method, but that it was written to be open even to students in the academy hoping to specialize in taijutsu. He did give a number of useful training tips about ways to put together or modify training regimes to maximize your benefit, without ever actually giving the knowledge of how to set up a shinobi-level routine. The real gem, however, came when he suggested using training weights. At that, Naruto slapped a hand against her forehead. I've claimed to be friends with Lee for how long, and I forgot that. Weights would almost certainly help with her agility training, and possibly with strength as well at the same time, for a side benefit. Now where would she get weights? So caught up in pondering where she would find the training weights she would need, Naruto completely missed a small child walking up behind her and looking over her shoulder. Who's made a guy? And why are you reading that? Naruto jumped out of her chair and darted away from the voice, while spinning to face the speaker. Pink hair and emerald eyes greeted her, as Sakura looked inquisitively at her. She then looked slightly nervous. I didn't mean to startle you. I won't bother you, she said sadly. No, it's fine, just was lost in thought, Naruto quickly replied, while looking around in fear. Sakura, she knew, was harmless, and probably would be for a good amount of past when it was reasonable to be harmless in their profession. No, she was more worried about her parents. One of them was a chunin if he remembered correctly. Oh, okay, Sakura said timidly but slightly hopefully. So who has made a guy, and why are you reading this? I saw you reading the game manuals over there, but they don't really seem connected. Calming slightly now that Sakura no longer looked like she was about to cry, though still wary that a parent might be about to descend on her, Naruto replied. Maida Guy is one of the premier Junin of Konoha, specializing in taijutsu. I'm hoping to join the academy and was looking for training tips. The game manuals were just to satisfy my curiosity about something. Sakura nodded. That makes sense. Do you really have to train though? That doesn't sound like much fun, and we can't even apply to the academy for years. Well, yeah, but training takes time. If I start now, maybe I won't be the dead last of the class when we start. She explained, using logic that Sakura would probably respect. She had started to stutter when she saw a woman he recognized as Sakura's mother looking thoughtfully at him from around the corner. When Haruno Mebuki had seen her precious daughter speaking to the demon child, she had nearly swooped in to snatch her daughter away. As a shinobi, she understood the basics of sealing, so she knew Naruto wasn't the Nine Tails itself, but she also knew that Jinchuriki were historically unstable. But then she saw something she hadn't expected. Naruto was terrified of her darling little girl. No, not of Sakura, of her, she realized. In that moment, as she watched the so-called demon girl calming her daughter, she realized that Naruto was just a scared little girl. And it wasn't an act, because she saw the moment Naruto realized she was there and the fear that crystallized in her eyes. She stepped around the corner. "Who is your friend Sakura?" she called out kindly. Naruto was a little surprised that she wasn't immediately dragging Sakura away. Was it truly possible she didn't recognize Naruto? No, she was a ninja, and old enough to be Sakura's mother, she definitely knew. "This is, I'm sorry I forgot to introduce myself," Sakura said sheepishly. "I'm Haruno Sakura. What's your name?" "Naruto Uzumaki," she said meekly. God damn it, she was sick of having to act timid and walk on eggshells with everyone. "Well, it's very good to meet you, Naruto," Mebuki said and knelt down while holding out a hand for Naruto to shake. Naruto quietly shook it, ready for the woman to hit her, but she didn't. "I was surprised to find a small child here. Usually kids your age like running around outside. I thought my little Sakura-chan was unique. I like reading," Naruto said. "And that's not even false." "Huh, imagine that. They have a lot of useful information and cool stories," she explained, thinking of the tale of the utterly gutsy shinobi. "And I don't have a lot of friends, so outside gets a little boring," she said looking down. "Well, I like reading too. So we can be friends. I get mommy to bring me here every week, so we can meet up then and read together, and talk about books, and Mebuki cut her daughter off there. "Will you be here next week, Naruto-chan?" Naruto could only nod numbly. "This didn't happen last time," was the only thought in her head. Did you know IAMALINE? 5 or so weeks of meetings with Sakura later, and Naruto had finally given up on waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sakura had shown up with her mother every week, and Sakura would sit at a table with her and talk about the book she was reading and what it was about. They were surprisingly advanced for their age, but then Sakura had only ever been second in brains to Shikamaru. It was that week, however, that Sakura invited him to go to the playground with her the next day. Naruto had agreed, swayed by the honest hope in Sakura's eyes. "This is going to be great. I can introduce you to Ino. She's this totally awesome girl I met yesterday. And she's really pretty and brave, and stood up to these bullies." Naruto's sweat dropped slightly. Maybe Sakura just had a slightly obsessive personality? Alright. I suppose I can take an extra day off from my training," Naruto acquiesced. "Not like I'm getting much done at this point anyways," she grumbled under her breath. She had hit the plateau of points in agility, and had yet to find a place that would sell her training weights. She had taken to training her other stats in the past week or so, simply to feel like she was still making progress. "Of course you can. You're really weird, you know that?" Sakura said, giving Naruto an exasperated look. "All you do is train, it's no fun. Even when we meet here you read those boring training manuals." Mebuki chimed in as she walked up to their table. "My daughter is correct. Taking training seriously is good, but you are 4. You won't start the academy for another year at least, and they will help you with training there. You can take some time to enjoy yourself," she advised. "The first several years won't even be testing you on your physical abilities, so you have nothing to worry about." Part of Naruto wanted to agree with the elder woman, that she did have plenty of time to work on her skills and get stronger. But another part of her knew that she was planning to interfere in an event that would pit her against Uchiha Itachi of all people far before she would graduate. "It's not the academy I'm worried about," she grumbled. "But you're probably right," she continued, before either of them could ask what she was worried about. Knowing she needed to explain her unusual worries for a child, she added, "I guess being in an orphan in a ninja village. I kinda assumed that my parents were ninja. And if they aren't here, they weren't ready for whatever killed them. I don't want that to be me someday is all." Naruto really hoped that they bought that. It was even technically true. Granted, no one could really be prepared for a Biju, but his parents weren't ready for Kurama. And he was worried about not being prepared for Itachi. "Oh, you poor girl," Mebuki murmured as she gently hugged Naruto. Why exactly were people terrified of this girl again? Sakura and I need to get going. But Naruto, enjoy your childhood. All this worry about your future, save it for when you're older. The village will make sure you have ample time to come into your strength. Naruto nodded, then nearly lost her composure at a system message. Ding! Through a special action, a new skill has been created. Acting, Active, Utility, LVL. 1, 0-100%, CP. 0, Basic. The ability to control your mannerisms and voice to emulate another. Improves chances to emulate others. Improves chances to deceive others. Naruto was confused. Why had she gotten this skill now? She had already had to trick Kakashi and Sarutobi once to avoid their suspicion. Was it because it worked? Son of a bitch, she cursed mentally. The only reason she could think of why she hadn't gotten the skill for trying to trick the Sandame was because she must have failed. Which meant he was now suspicious of her training already. She really would have to cut back on her training schedule. See you tomorrow, Naruto. Sakura called as she left with her mother. Naruto waved quietly, while mentally cursing. People were catching on to the fact that she wasn't acting her age. If she wanted to keep her ability and foreknowledge under wraps, she would have to greatly reduce her training time. Which would be a disadvantage in its own way. Swearing, she wondered what she was going to do, before eventually finishing her reading and going home for the day. At CHARATER creation, I chose line for my race. Naruto groaned as she collapsed into a seat at the academy. The school was exactly as she remembered it, though she was a little foggy about specifics this far back. She hadn't exactly spent a lot of time here the first few years. Or any year really. Cutting class was far more fun. But the cookie-cutter classroom was the same as the one Iruka had taught in, with several rows of desks climbing in height towards the back of the room, and with a chalkboard and desk for the teacher. Windows covered one wall, which Naruto was seated next to, though there wasn't much of a view with a row of trees in the way. Upper years were the ones who got a nice view from the other upper floors. It was close to 2 years later, and her first year at the academy. She could have started a year earlier, but that was typically avoided by most families, as they wanted their kids to be kids. Naruto had wanted to start then but knew that doing so would have put her in a different graduating class than the original timeline. Also, the Sandame wouldn't let her. Sitting down far more calmly next to her, Sakura and Ino took the other 2 seats in her row. After that first outing with them, Naruto had been dragged into Ino's orbit and become a member of her group of friends. A group of friends which became significantly smaller after the parents had found out. Most of the time it was just Naruto, Sakura, Ino, and through her Shikamaru and Choji. Occasionally a child would join them for a day or two before being dragged off by their parents. In a surprising show of solidarity, Ino had stood by Naruto and stayed her friend. Partially due to her father's influence. Haruno Mebuki had talked to him about his irrationality concerning Naruto, and convinced him to give her a chance. Soon after, he had been won over by Naruto as well, and encouraged his daughter to stay with Naruto since they got along famously. Probably because Ino was at heart as much a prankster as Naruto. She just used words and gossip over paint and traps. When Naruto realized that Ino had deliberately tricked her into embarrassing herself repeatedly, a prank war ensued which lasted until parents were forced to intervene. Which had shortly led to an alliance against parental intervention and a fast friendship. The Anbu now got extremely nervous whenever the two were spotted plotting. Between Naruto's traps and stealth, and Ino's gossiping and manipulative streak, no one was safe. Naruto had not been able to do much training in the intervening years. With the vast majority of adults around her, that didn't despise her, trying to get her to act like a child, there was very little she could do to get additional training, and as a result her training had plateaued, leaving her with stats largely around where the average teenager should be. Phenomenal for her age, but nowhere near what she would need. But now that she was in the academy, all of that should change. Now she would be encouraged to train, not treated as weird. Ino and Sakura, however, were about to meet Sasuke, and Naruto was dreading what would happen when they started to fangirl. He was already plotting as many ways as possible to break them from the bad habits they would form. Just then the Chunin teacher for his class walked into the room. Iruka wouldn't be teaching Naruto's class for another several years, when the Sandame would spot the teachers blatantly abusing her and cleaning house before installing Iruka as the new teacher for her class. The first time the teachers had been able to disguise their hatred of Naruto, which allowed them to sabotage her grades without her knowledge, but this time a far more aware and attentive Naruto spotted the teacher's subtle glare in her direction. Of course none of the other students noticed, but Naruto wondered if she could expose them early by bringing the sabotage to the Hokage's attention. Better not risk it, she decided. She wasn't sure what had prompted the homage to pick Iruka to be her teacher, but she might get someone worse if she messed with things. After the teacher took roll, he introduced himself. "Good afternoon, my name is Kazuki Tamaki. While in my class you will remain silent while I am speaking, and refer to me as Sensei or Tamaki-sensei." After taking a breath, he continued. "For the first few years here at the academy we will be focusing on academic subjects such as history and math, and developing your physical abilities. Can anyone tell me why?" Naruto almost answered, but realized it would call too much attention to himself. He had had no one to teach him about chakra, so there was no way he could know the answer. When no one raised their hand, he explained. "The thing that separates a ninja from a common soldier is chakra," he said, emphasizing the word chakra. "Chakra enables us to reinforce our bodies, and perform almost all of our techniques. Chakra is created by mixing together your physical and spiritual energies, each of which can be studied by increasing your physical and mental abilities. Hence you will be training in both Shinogi arts and mundane subjects to increase both attributes." It was a fairly standard practice between the academies, as Naruto had learned while talking with ninja from other villages during the Fourth Shinobi War. He had often complained about not needing to know when the village was founded. It had been and now existed, and that's all Naruto cared about. However, she had been missing the point, even after it had been restated during the Chunin exams. If you had a weak mind, you had less spiritual energy, and therefore less chakra, so it made sense to train one's mind to increase your chakra stores. Though now that she thought about it, she wasn't sure which of her game attributes chakra was determined by. "Nay, Kurama, what stat does chakra draw from? If it's a mix of physical and spiritual energies, it wouldn't make sense if it drew on just one." "It doesn't. Chakra is determined by comparing your total mental attributes, intelligence and wisdom, to your physical attributes, strength and agility. Whichever is smaller times 3, and plus the base 100 everyone has is your maximum," the fox replied gruffly before cutting the connection. He had been getting more short-tempered, and slept more lately. Naruto decided he must be bored, not that she blamed him. She was too. His explanation made sense though. While many video games used intelligence to determine the energy pool of characters, chakra was a mix of both spiritual and physical energy, so you would need both to make it. By using the lower of the two aspects, the system was effectively ensuring you could create the correct balance. Naruto was dragged out of her thoughts as the teacher snapped at her for daydreaming. Sakura and Ino both gave her an exasperated look. In time and almost identical, since they had practiced it to annoy her. She had a tendency to zone out a lot when she was talking to Kurama. "As I was saying, for the first class period today, we shall be working on meditation and unlocking your chakra. We want to get you kids started on this as early as possible, as chakra control can be difficult to learn, and is a critical skill." He sat on his desk in a meditative position before continuing. "Now I want everyone to sit in a position like this. Position isn't critical to meditation, but it can help beginners get in the right mindset." The students all hopped onto their desks and arranged themselves in as similar a position to their teacher as they could manage. Naruto shifted herself to the left and turned so that she could rest her back against the wall as she meditated. "Good, now I want you all to close your eyes, and breathe deeply and slowly." Naruto tuned the teacher out. What he was teaching was the basics of meditation, something that Naruto had already mastered. Slipping easily into a meditative state, she began hunting for the corner of her mind that led to her chakra. It might have been easier to go through her mindscape to locate the mental representation of her chakra coils, as she could just follow the pipes back to their source, but she already figured she would be one of the first to find her chakra. She had been last time too, simply having as much as she did made it act like a beacon, and this time she knew what she was doing. She just didn't want to draw too much attention, so she was doing it the hard way. Eventually she found it. A massive floating ball of blue flame, burning so intensely it looked almost white. She smiled as she reached out and touched it, feeling the familiar surge of energy she had missed flowing through her. She had tried several times to unlock her chakra previously, but the system had prevented her and said that she needed a trainer to help with this. Thankfully the academy qualified. As she opened her eyes she looked around and spotted several others having already unlocked their chakra. Choji and Kiba, as well as Ino, who was giving Naruto an odd look. "Naruto, I can see your chakra. How much are you putting out?" Cursing mentally, Naruto dialed back hard on her chakra. "I dunno. I just sorta pulled and that's what came." Naruto laughed sheepishly as a wave of fatigue washed over her. "Guess I need to be a bit more careful than that. My control is just as abysmal as last time, maybe a tiny bit better but not much." Ino shook her head. "Only you, Naruto. I know Daddy said you had a huge chakra store, but that's just crazy. Anyway, go grab a scroll from the teacher. We are supposed to be working on control after this," she said. "The scroll has a couple of tricks on it for the first exercise." Naruto nodded and walked to the front of the room. "Ah, got your chakra going already? And quite a bit too." The Chunin greeted her with a friendliness that didn't nearly reach his eyes. "Here you go," he said, handing her a scroll. One Naruto noticed didn't come from the pile on the desk. "Read over the scroll and then start the exercise, but don't worry if it takes a while. With as much chakra as you have you might never reach this level of finesse, but the exercise will still help you." Grinning at the man, despite his probable sabotage, Naruto took the scroll back to her desk and sat down to read. "Collect a leaf. Stick leaf to your forehead. Channel chakra to the leaf to make it stay." Naruto scowled behind the scroll, making sure to keep her face hidden from the teacher. Schooling her features, Naruto leaned out the window next to her and grabbed several leaves from the convenient tree. And sat back in her tree. "Naruto, how are you done reading that fast? I started way before you." Ino asked from her seat. Naruto faked a confused expression and looked at her. "There were like 3 lines, how slow a reader are you?" Ino squawked at the insult. "There are several paragraphs you dunce. Let me see your scroll." Looking it over, front and back, Ino raised an eyebrow in confusion. "Weird. Must be a draft scroll or something that got mixed in. You should get another." "Somehow I don't think that will work," Naruto thought. Looking at the teacher, she saw he was busy helping another student who had asked for help understanding the scroll. "He looks busy though, why don't I just follow along with you?" Naruto asked. Ino shrugged and scooted over to her so they could pore over the scroll together. Half an hour later and Naruto was boiling. Thankfully the seal had not been loosened at all yet, and was heavily limiting Kurama's chakra, otherwise Naruto might have been in trouble. "Motherfucking damn it. ARRG. Seriously Kami D." Naruto cut himself off mid-swear there, as after she learned that there actually was a Kami, he figured swearing in their name was probably pushing it. "I spent how many years doing this exercise and shredding leaves and I was doing it backwards." In amongst several other chakra manipulation tips, which Naruto had figured out for herself in the previous timeline, albeit years later, was the instructions for how she was supposed to be channeling chakra into the leaf. Specifically, she was supposed to be cycling her chakra out around the edges and then pulling it in through the center. All she had been doing had been shoving chakra through the leaf. Plopping down now that she knew what she was doing, Naruto plopped down into the seat and picked up her first leaf. Placing it against her forehead, she gently pushed her chakra through the outer edges, and blew the leaf off her forehead. 20 minutes later, and finally Naruto managed to stick the leaf to her forehead. For about half a second, but it was progress. She grinned and grabbed another leaf. Dang! Through a special action a new skill has been created. Leaf exercise, active, utility, LVL. 01, 0% carbon monophosphide, 5 per minute. An exercise to train one's chakra control. Allows the user to stick a leaf to part of their body using only their chakra. Dang! As a result of another skill a new skill has been created. Chakra control, passive, utility, LVL. Max, 0% carbon monophosphide. 0, basic. One's ability to manipulate their chakra control is increased by leveling up various control training exercises. Current minimum chakra draw, 1%. Naruto grinned, she loved this system, it made everything so much easier to handle. Then she winced when she realized how much she was going to have to level up her control. Based on her current chakra she could pull out at minimum around 800 CP. Based on the pull of the leaf exercise which Sakura could keep up for an hour or two, Bunshin probably had a pull of 15 or 20 CP. Naruto groaned. At least she knew why it was impossible this time. Though seeing the basic tag on one of her skills but not another reminded her to ask Kurama about it. Basic skills are skills which represent the most general application of something. For example, your stealth skill represents your ability to not be detected, but will be modified by skills like silent movement or hiding, depending on your situation. Once you learn them, he explained when she asked. Naruto mentally nodded, though she didn't move her physical head as it was currently occupied. And I already figured out that active and passive means whether I have to activate the skill or not. She thought. And I guess the other note is what type of skill it is. You're not wrong. Not completely right either, but you are a dense brat. That is a decent enough explanation though. Kurama yawned. Naruto nodded and went back to practicing her leaf exercise until the period ended. I am many things. All of them variations of line. Naruto sighed as she collapsed onto her bed that night. She had spent the entire rest of the day working on the leaf exercise at every spare moment. She had blown straight through the physical exercises, though she was careful not to appear too spectacular. She had already made too many waves. The academic portion had been boring as hell, and when she tried to practice the leaf exercise to pass the time, she had been kicked out by her teacher. Still, despite spending the entire day working on it, she had barely ground out 1% of the XP towards its first level. She didn't know if that was because she was so bad at it or because it really required that much practice, but it was frustrating. She comforted herself with the thought that she had a couple of years to work on it before anything happened.
That's all for now. If you enjoy this video, then please like, share and do comments.